Hello, everybody. Welcome back to our video Bible study series. This is Functioning as the Lord's Church. I hope that you and your family continue to be healthy and well. Before we get started in tonight's class, I want to go ahead and let you know that the next 2 Wednesdays, there will not be a new video. There's going to be a short break in these. Now, there may be some other videos or materials that we share or that we post during this time, but just don't be looking for a new Functioning as the Lord's Church until 3 weeks from tonight, and that's when the next one will come out. Okay, thank you. Now, when we're talking about functioning as the Lord's church, you remember the question we're answering: what exactly do Christians do? And we examine the teaching of the New Testament to find out. And please understand, when we say church, functioning as the Lord's church, we aren't referring to the building. The Lord's church is the family of God, made up of believers. And as we noted in our discussion of John 4, God is seeking true worshipers, those who will worship Him in spirit and in truth. And so the believers, the true worshipers, the ones who have obeyed the gospel and are loyal to God, these are the church. If we are faithful Christians, we are the Lord's church. And that's exactly the idea we want to carry forward into this discussion. Now, talking about worship. We've been a couple of classes into this topic. Last time we did the 5 A's out of John 4:24, and you remember the absolute, we must worship, it's not an optional thing. The action, worship, and we talked specifically about proskuneo, that idea of to kiss toward, to pay that reverence to God. The aim, it is Him. We must worship Him. And our worship is not to be directed to some man or angel or to ourselves. We worship God. And then attitude and authority were the last 2 A's. The attitude, that we would worship in spirit, and also the authority, that we would worship in truth. That is, we're doing the things that God has required, what He has shown that He wants in worship, and we're doing so engaged with our heart, understanding the spiritual significance of these things, more than just the outward actions, the externals of it. We want the internal. We want our heart to be close to God, not just our words drawing near to Him. Now, as we continue in this discussion, realize how basic or how universal worship is. It was once said that humans are instinctively worshiping creatures. You may have heard a preacher or someone talk before about the God-shaped hole. And that is that we all have a void in our heart. We have a desire for God, for a greater being, for someone to worship. And there are many people who fill that God-shaped hole with the wrong thing, whether it's drugs and drink, or whether it's some false god or idol, whether it's just a love of self and all that narcissism, that doesn't truly satisfy. But we have been created by our loving God, and I believe we instinctively desire that proper relationship where we are the creation and we want to come before Creator. We have a yearning to worship. Think about Psalm 42. The first verse of that is where we get the song, As the Deer. As the deer pants for the water brooks, so pants my soul for you, O God. And this desire, some people try and deny it. They say, well, what about the atheist? Well, whether it's a cow or the sun or a wooden statue or the one true God, or even yourself and your intellect or mankind's achievements, we all worship something or someone. I think those who deny that they're worshiping or that they would worship, they've fallen into this new age humanism idea that man is worthy of worship, or that we should be lauded, exalted. And of course, this isn't the teaching of the Bible. But the norm for humanity is worshiping. That is part of our desire, part of our culture, if you will, in humanity, in our thinking. So the question then would be, whom do we worship? How do we worship? When, where, and why? And, previous lessons have touched on some of this, and some will cover in more. But for tonight's purposes, for this class and this video, what actions or what activity constitutes worship? What counts as worship, in other words, and what actions are not worship? Some have suggested that all of life is worship. that all human activity for the Christian is worship to God. And, to varying degrees, you can see people try and explain this, where every action and even inaction is called worship. Before we get deeper into this question, is all of life worship? I want to show you 3 different quotations. These come from books published by people who are not members of the church or wayward members. And let's look at these together and read through them. The first quote comes from Mike Root in his book, Unbroken Bread. He says, "Worship is a life given in obedience to God. It's not a when or where proposition, but a what. It's what we are. You can't go to it or leave it. You can't dress for it or from it. You can't start it or stop it. It doesn't open and close with a prayer. And it doesn't have a human leader or a special day." The second quotation here is from Fred Blakely in Banner of Truth. He wrote, "God has spelled out no formula for the worship of himself." And then the last one here from F.J. Winder, or perhaps Winder, in Music of the Saints, he says, "One is actually worshiping all of the time." Now, we wouldn't agree with any one of these quotes. They are all problematic. This is all, as far as the Bible goes, false teaching. And it's a misrepresentation or misunderstanding of worship. And you can see from these quotes and from the specific wording that they're choosing, the all of life is worship movement is really being used as an attack. It is designed to tear away certain things from true religion and from the teaching of the Bible. Notice how just reading through that, you can see stress placed on feeling and emotion rather than stressing truth and responsibility. These are pushing for the casual, pushing for informality. They want convenient devotion to Christ. Notice also how it's about pleasing self while pretending to please God. And so the all of life is worship movement is used as an attack on the importance of the first day of the week. It's used as an attack on the reverent attitude required for the worshiper. It's used as an attack on the authority that God has given to elderships in the local congregation. It's an attack on the importance God placed on assembling with other Christians and the responsibility that we have to our brothers and sisters. It's an attack on the commands God gave concerning authorized worship practices. And the all of life is worship movement is often used or leads to a belief that instrumental music would be proper worship, or that a woman's role could be expanded to include leading in worship, preaching, or some other type. So there's a lot of problems leading up to or leading out of this belief. And you can see from these quotes how just a little bit of confusion really has dark consequences. So we need to make sure that we're using Bible words in Bible ways. If we're talking about worship in a way that is totally different from the way the Bible describes worship, we know we've got a problem. But this is the question, and this is what we want to deal with in tonight's class. Is all of life worship? Let's take a step back from those scary quotes and all the attacks on doctrinal matters. If you just look at this question on the face of it, it might sound like something sort of appealing, because I think it sounds very spiritual. And stay with me through this. When someone starts to profess that all of life could be worship, they're really promoting the idea of a very close relationship with God. And they'll say everything Christians do is worship. Even the mundane tasks of life, when I go through those, I am still worshiping God. And it suggests, like we say, that very close personal relationship. Someone is really boasting about a great link that they have to God, that they're always worshiping through all that they do. Every action of life is worship, because that's how spiritual, that's how holy they are. Now, it's true that we should glorify God day to day in our life. It's true that we should exalt Christ by the decisions that we make. But it's not true to say every action is worship, or to say that every action is even capable of being worship. It is a misuse of the word worship. And like we said, a misunderstanding that leads to serious consequences. Worship in the Bible is a definite act It is aimed at God. Worship is intentional. It's not automatic. It's not accidental. It's not arbitrary. We saw a lot of this in last class period when we talked about the aim and action of worship, that we are worshiping God and that we must choose to do it in the proper way. God requires that we would do it based on His criteria. So we should make it our goal to glorify God in all our life, yes, but we do not worship God with every action of our life. Allow me to take this just a step further. Some actions which we do are not and cannot be directed to God. They simply don't rise to the level of what the Bible calls worship. Now, when we think about the first day of the week, Christian men and women come together, and specifically, we assemble on the first day of the week to observe the Lord's Supper. And this is part of our worship, that we partake of the bread, symbolic of Christ's body, that we partake of the fruit of the vine, symbolic of Christ's blood. This, according to the Bible, is worship. Now compare this to some other actions that men and women do. We take time for recreation. And that's not wrong. Recreation isn't wrong. I'm not saying it's sinful. Don't misunderstand me. All I'm saying is recreation is not worship. We even read in the Bible about Jesus taking time to rest. We read about Him speaking to the disciples and saying, take some time to rest. And when we take our time resting, maybe we like to go fishing. It's a recreational activity, somewhere where we can forget the troubles of life, forget work, forget those responsibilities, and just sort of enjoy ourselves. And done appropriately, like we said, there's nothing wrong with it. But it's not worship. And can't you see the difference between fishing and partaking the Lord's Supper? These are not the same. Well, we also take time for shopping. And whether it's luxury items or clothing or jewelry or even shopping for groceries, this is not the worship. It's something that we do, it's an activity, but it's certainly not done speaking to God's worth. It's certainly not something that we have a command and approved example of this being done to pay reverence to God. And you can see these actions are not the same. We can get even more ridiculous if you'd like to. What about Sunday afternoon when you lean back in your chair and take a nap? Napping can't be worship. Sleeping at night can't be worship. You're not even conscious through this period. And like we said, worship is an intentional act. That's the way it's always portrayed in the Bible. Worship is never used to describe a lifestyle, a 24/7 ongoing action. Our service, our loyalty to God, perhaps, but not our worship. You can't say that you're worshiping while you are asleep. If we wanted to get even more ludicrous, we could talk about when you're in the shower or when you go to the restroom. These actions do not rise to the level of worship, of what's true worship described in the Bible. What about eating and drinking? We must, because of our needs, because of our physical bodies, we must eat and drink. That is necessary for our survival, but it's not worship. And so you can see very clearly that all of life is not worship. Now, some of these things can relate to Christian service. And you think about it, you could go shopping to buy things that you will use to give to the needy, to the poor. You could go shopping to buy things that you'll need for Vacation Bible School or something like that. You could eat and drink with members of the church where you're sharing that meal and that time of fellowship after worship is over. But again, service is not equal to worship. The way one preacher said it, and we can talk more about this later, they said that all worship is service to God, but not all service to God is worship. There is a distinction to be made. Now, again, comparing it back to that first image, when we assemble to observe the Lord's Supper, when we're there on the first day of the week, we have a set purpose in mind. And in fact, we are required to have our mind centered on Christ. And we examine ourselves to see that we are fulfilling this command, that we are believing Him and that we are living as those who understand what it is to be in the kingdom. These actions, these other actions, simply cannot be equal to that. Are we really supposed to believe that there's no difference between a Christian eating a bowl of cereal and a Christian partaking the Lord's Supper? If you say all of life is worship, if you say both those actions are worship, you're kind of teaching that. What about when we get together and we're powerfully singing, "Our God, He is alive"? Now, that is a time of engaged worship. We're speaking to God's worth. We are teaching and admonishing our brothers and sisters. This is a time where our hearts, our minds are centered on Christ. That does not equal the time when I am unconscious because I'm sleeping or taking a nap, a time of rest. These things are not the same. And consider, if the all of life is worship teaching was true, and there really was no religious difference between eating a bowl of cereal and coming together to sing praises to God, then why would we even worship in that setting? Why would we even come together for that purpose if we were doing just as good off on our own? And like we said, this movement, it attacks our responsibility to our brothers and sisters in the local congregation, certainly to the elders leading that congregation. We're not looking toward others and their good, not looking to exalt God. We're only looking to self if we're trying to use this to justify selfish practices. And no, I haven't forgotten about worship that's done away from the church building. Private prayer or singing that might be done in the home with the family. That can take place away from the church building, away from the rest of the church family, in the privacy of the home. But still, these are very different actions. Worship is intentional. When you do that in your home, you're saying, okay, now I'm going to pray. Or maybe with your wife and kids, you say, now we're going to sing songs. Now we're going to study the Bible. Now we're going to spend time in prayer as a family. You are choosing to engage in that and direct it towards God. If worship is automatic and 24/7, where's the direction? Where's the aim? Worship must have an object. Worship is speaking to the worth of. So if you're worshiping by default, what are you speaking to the worth of? What are you showing has a value to you? No, it must be intentional. It's not automatic. You decide to engage in worship. And so it is intentional, it's directed to God, and because of that, it must be done according to His prescribed criteria. Okay, let's look at some verses that are going to help us understand that not all of life is worship. I want to begin in Genesis chapter 22, and it's interesting, this text is actually the first time that the English word worship appears in the Bible. At least in the New King James, but I'm pretty sure that's consistent across other English versions, the first appearance of worship. Now, you do read about those who called on the name of the Lord, and you do read about offerings and sacrifices as early as Genesis 4, but the first time that worship appears is right here. So Genesis 22, start in verse 3. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and Isaac his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Then on the 3rd day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. And Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you." Now, notice what's described in these 3 verses. What does Abraham do after God instructs him to sacrifice the child of promise? Well, first, he rose early in the morning. Not yet worshiping in verse 3. He gets up from his sleep. He rose early in the morning. Then he saddled his donkey. Still not yet worshiping. It's preparatory, but he's not yet worshiping. He puts the saddle on the beast. Then he split the wood for the offering. Not yet worshiping. This is physical labor, and we could talk about being at work and the things that you would do, manual labor, but that is not devotion to God. That's not the worship to God. Then he went to the place of which the Lord showed him. Well, that's traveling, not yet worshiping. It's preparatory. He's on the way, but not yet. And then notice what he says to the servants that are with him. The lad and I will go yonder and worship. Okay, so we have prepared the wood, we have prepared the donkey, we have come to this place. Now we are going to worship. This is a separate action from sleeping or rising in the morning or getting supplies together. Now's going to be worship. He doesn't say we were worshiping all through this and we're going to go and worship some more. He says we're going for this reason. Notice also, as a side note here, he shows his faith in God and the Lord's ability to raise his son from the dead, because he says, the lad and I will go, and we will come back to you. That even sacrificing his son couldn't take his life, because God will provide. So the faith that is shown there. But then, even speaking to our issue here, when he says, we will come back to you, that's indicating that they're going to worship. Then when worship has concluded, they will come back. So this action of worship, it has a definite start and a definite end. The understanding and the implication is when he and the lad come back to the servants and the donkey and they're traveling home, that they will no longer be worshiping, because they came to this place, they worshiped, and once that's accomplished, they will return together. And so worship is not all of life based on what we see here. Take it further through the Bible. If you go to Exodus 24 and verse 1, now he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. So again, we see it as a separate action from what they had been doing. He says, you come and then worship. The idea is they will be before God, and in the text, Moses gets to come closer than the rest. There's a period of worship and then a return when worship ceases at the end of worship. Maybe another great text on this idea has to do with King David. Now you remember, after his sin with Bathsheba, the child conceived there died. And we see David, while the child is sick, he is weeping, he is very distressed over this situation. But then after the child dies, he goes to worship God. Notice the way this is described. 2 Samuel 12 and verse 20. So David arose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. Now, a couple of things are very clear here. He wasn't worshiping while he was weeping, while he was in his distress. But then after he hears and understands the child has died, he makes a decision. When he hears that, he gets up, he washes, still not worship, but it is preparation. He changes clothes, and then he went to the house of the Lord and worshiped. It was a definite act that he chose to do at a certain time. Notice also the phrase after that, then he went to his own house. Well, this shows us again that there was a time of worship, and then once that action was finished, it ceased, it was concluded, then he went home. Then he broke his fast. Then he ate. There was a definite period of worship. It had a definite beginning and a definite ending. It started and it ceased. Now, this goes right against one of those quotes that we saw early on. Those who are promoting this all of life is worship teaching. It doesn't match the Bible. It doesn't match what we read in the text. Now, bring this idea further with me. Let's come into the New Testament. In Matthew 2, 1 and 2, we read about the wise men. It says, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? Notice this phrase at the end. For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Now, what we see here, the wise men before Herod, they propose to do something. They speak of their intended plan. We have come for this reason, to worship. Again, it is an intentional act. And you can see further in the chapter that they do follow up on that proposal, on that intention. In Matthew 2 and verse 11, when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. When they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Okay, so when they get to Jesus, the wise men choose to worship him. That is, they follow up on their proposed intention with appropriate action. They engage in worship. You remember, we talked about the action and aim of worship, that those who worship must worship him in spirit and in truth. They choose to worship God. Here they are before God in the flesh, Emmanuel, before Jesus, and so they worship him, and it's proper. They have come and they have done that which they set out to do. They direct this action of worship. The word for worship here in Matthew 2, it is proskuneo, a form of that. Proskuneo is made up of two words. Kuneo speaks of the idea to kiss, and pros is to or toward, so it is to kiss toward. And this is used to illustrate bowing oneself or paying reverence to one. And so they are paying reverence to the King of Kings. They are paying reverence to Christ, the Son of God, who is God. And the idea of bowing before him, all these things, very appropriate action because they have the right aim. They are worshiping God. You remember, if it's automatic, it's not directional. You're not choosing the object of your worship, the aim of your worship. But no, it's not automatic, it's intentional. And they say, we will worship the child. We will worship Jesus. They didn't worship Herod. They weren't worshiping themselves or other wise men. They came to worship Jesus. They chose to do that. We also see examples in the New Testament of those who choose poorly about worship. But again, it's an intentional act. In Acts 10, when Peter and Cornelius come together after God reveals to both sides what he's going to do here, Acts 10:25, as Peter was coming in, Cornelius met him and fell down at his feet and worshiped him. Verse 26, but Peter lifted him up, saying, stand up, I myself am also a man. Now, does this text fit with the idea of ongoing 24/7 directionless worship, or does it say that worship is an intentional act? Well, you can see very clearly when Peter came in, Cornelius, he didn't accidentally worship Peter. He chose to fall down at Peter's feet and intentionally paid reference to Peter as if he was worthy of receiving worship, and he wasn't. Cornelius chose poorly here, but Peter's reaction is great. He says, stand up. He says, you've been doing wrong. Now ask yourself the question, if the all of life is worship teaching is true, and worship is accidental, arbitrary, or automatic, then why the rebuke? Why does Peter say, stand up, I myself am also a man? Why didn't he say, oh, I understand worship is just always going on and you're not doing anything wrong? No, he said, you have done wrong here. Worship is an intentional act and it needs to be directed toward God. Worship is not automatic, and every action that we do is not worship. This, by the way, Acts 10, is very similar to John and the angel in Revelation 22. Now, this appears in Revelation 19 as well as chapter 22, but let's look at this one here, verse 8 and 9. Now I, John, saw and heard these things, and when I heard and saw, I fell down to worship before the feet of the angel who showed me these things. Then he said to me, see that you do not do that. Now, verse 9 goes on from there, but again, if worship is accidental or arbitrary and automatic, why the rebuke? Well, the rebuke is there because worship is an intentional act that you choose to engage in, and here John chose wrong. He chose poorly. He chose to worship the angel of God, speaking to his worth, rather than speaking to God's worth. So the lesson is we must choose to engage in focused and authorized worship. When you read about true worship in the Bible, it is directed to God, it is intentional, it must be done according to his prescribed criteria, and it has a definite beginning and ending point. So when we're looking at this question, is all of life worship? We have to say no. Based on what the Bible says, based on what's presented about worship, really in every age, whether we're talking about the time of the patriarchs or the time of the law of Moses or the Christian age, in every age, you find that worship is not made up of every action in an individual's life. Worship is for a specific purpose, and it's our specific time of speaking to God's worth. So we will cherish every precious moment devoted to worship, but we're not worshiping every moment, and we need to understand this. We're going to take this idea further in our next class. Like we said, there's going to be a little break, but I want to come back to this issue and look at where the all of life is worship belief comes from and what verses might they use to try and justify or to teach this idea. And what we'll find as we look at it really is just a misunderstanding of terms. Because like we said, we are to glorify God every day of our lives. We are to exalt Christ by our words, by our actions, by our decisions, but not every action and decision is worship. You remember that some of the ways we spend our time can't be worship. Sleeping, shopping, eating, these aren't directed to God, and even if they could be, which is doubtful, we don't have authorization to worship God through these modes. And so we need to understand the difference here. So that'll do it for this time. I'm looking at about 30 minutes on the clock here. So we will pick up with this idea next time, going a little further through the topic of worship. I hope that you and your family continue to be well. Thank you for clicking on this, for going through this study with me. We'll see you again soon. God bless.